Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're going to do something that sounds, well, a little like science fiction. We're going to try and count the ghosts of a lost world. We're talking about the real number of dinosaurs that ever lived, a number that is just way, way bigger than anything you've seen in a museum.
So, to wrap our heads around this huge idea, let's just start with one, the most famous one of all. It's a question that feels totally impossible to answer, right? How many T-Rexes actually stomped across this planet during their reign? Are we talking a few thousand, maybe hundreds of thousands?
Well, the scientifically calculated answer is staggering. It's not just a big number, it's a mind-bogglingly huge one. And figuring out how we got to that number isn't just a cool piece of trivia. It actually forces us to completely rethink deep time and the fossil record itself.
Okay, so how on earth do you count animals that vanished 66 million years ago? It's not like we can send out census takers. The challenge seems immense, especially when you stop and think about just how incredibly rare fossils actually are.
The secret, it turns out, isn't just about digging for more bones. It's about using some really clever statistical tools and using data from the world we can see all around us today to build a mathematical picture of a world we can't.
So let's dive into the details. We're going to focus just on T-Rex for a minute to see exactly how paleontologists were able to build a census for an animal that's been extinct for millions of years. It's some seriously cool scientific detective work.
The whole calculation really hinges on this powerful ecological rule called Damuth's law. And it's actually pretty intuitive. In modern ecosystems, big animals, like elephants, need a lot of space, right? They're pretty spread out. But small animals, like mice, can be packed in way, way tighter. That relationship between an animal's size and its population density is the key.
So, a groundbreaking study from 2021, led by Charles Marshall, basically laid out a four-step recipe. First, you figure out the average weight of a T-Rex. Then, you use Damuth's law to estimate how many could live in a square kilometer. Next, you map out their entire territory, their stomping grounds. And finally, the last step, you multiply all of that by how long the species was actually around.
So, after running all the numbers through this framework, factoring in all sorts of variables like growth rates and average lifespans, the team came up with some figures that are, well, they're just plain astonishing. They give us a real glimpse into the planetary footprint of T-Rex.
Get this. At any single moment in time during the late Cretaceous, the researchers estimated there were about 20,000 adult T-Rexes alive on Earth. To put that into perspective for you, that's roughly the same number of lions that are alive today.
But remember, that's just a snapshot in time. T-Rex as a species existed for something like 2.4 million years. When you calculate the total number of individuals across all of those generations, you get this staggering number. 2.5 billion T-Rexes lived and died on our planet.
And this right here, is what really shows you how miraculous every single fossil is. Of the 2.5 times billion T-Rexes that ever lived, we've only found the remains of a tiny handful. The odds of any one of them becoming a fossil that we would find 66 million years later? About 1 in 80 million. Just insane.
So, okay, if we can apply this logic to the king of the dinosaurs, can we scale it up? Can we even try to count the total number of dinosaur species that ever existed? Now, that is a much bigger, much more complicated question. Different research teams have been tackling it using a whole range of statistical models, trying to estimate not just individuals, but the total number of distinct species and genera across the entire Mesozoic era. And what's really fascinating is how they're approaching this from all these different angles. You can count the individuals of one species, like the 2.5 billion T-Rexes, or you can use models, like one called TRIPS, to estimate the total number of distinct species. They landed on about 1,900. And other models focus on genera. That's the classification just above species. And they end up in a very similar ballpark.
Now, these new estimates aren't just about satisfying our curiosity with these giant numbers. They're actively rewriting some really long-held ideas about the final days of the dinosaurs, forcing us to completely reconsider the story of their extinction.
For decades, the story we were all told was that dinosaurs were already in a slow decline when the asteroid hit. And that idea came from a pretty simple place. If you just count the raw number of fossils, you find fewer species in those last few million years. But these new methods show that this decline was probably just an illusion, a bias in the data caused by the simple fact that rock layers from that specific time are just harder to find.
So, the big takeaway here is that once you account for those gaps and biases in the fossil record, you get a much healthier, much more stable picture of the dinosaur world. It really looks like they weren't fading away. They were going strong right up until the very end. And this all leads to one final, and I think really thrilling realization. If there were so many billions of dinosaurs spread across so many hundreds of species, and we found such a tiny, tiny fraction of them, just how much is still out there, waiting for us? Well, according to a 2006 study by Wang and Dodson, all the hundreds of dinosaur genera we know about, that represents less than a third of the total number that are probably out there to be discovered. That means over 70% of the dinosaur story is still buried in rock. And we are finding them at a frankly astonishing rate. The pace of discovery has just accelerated like crazy in recent decades. Paleontologists actually predict that within the next century, we could go from knowing just that 29% to knowing the vast majority of all discoverable dinosaurs.
And ultimately, this isn't just about collecting new names for a list. Each new discovery, when you combine it with these powerful new ways of looking at data, adds another piece to the puzzle of this lost ecosystem. It lets us understand these animals not as movie monsters, but as a real, living part of our planet's history.
What this work really shows us is that the story of the dinosaurs is not a closed book. Far from it. The golden age of discovery isn't something that happened in the past. We are living in it right now. And it really makes you wonder, what unbelievable secret is still waiting in the stone?